Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at the 19th Annual Acquisition Research Symposium, hosted by the Acquisition Research Program at the Naval Postgraduate School. And welcome to Panel 3, Understanding Today's Defense Industrial Base. I'm Larry Jackson, Director of the Center for Joint and Strategic Logistics at the National Defense University, and I'll be chairing this panel. I'm joined today by panelists Robert Mortlock of the Naval Postgraduate School, Amanda Bressler with PW Communications, Moshe Schwartz of Etherton and Associates, and Emily Murphy of Georgetown University. And I'll start our conversation today by commenting just briefly on the critical importance of the defense industrial base as we seek to deter great power conflict in the years to come and support our allies and partners in the present. We need look no further than the tremendous logistics effort now engaged to support Ukraine in its fight for survival against Russia to understand just how relevant these papers are. They offer great insights and they have practical suggestions for much needed improvements. Of course, you're already here, so you probably know that, and I don't need to say anything more about that. So in just a moment, I'll turn this over to our panelists, they'll introduce themselves and give their presentations, and then we'll have some time for questions. So for those of you out there in audience land, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to pose questions for panelists. We'll answer your questions after everyone has presented. So with no further ado, Bob, over to you, Dr. Mortlock.
Well, thank you very much, Larry. And it's a pleasure to speak with you all today and be a member of this distinguished panel. I'm going to give an overview of some research that I'm interested in. One of my fascinations is case studies. And this is a research case study it fits in within the industrial base. The reason it's so important, I think, is because we continually see the same things happening in defense acquisition year after year. So the documentation of these case studies and the fact that we can share them broadly with all the acquisition community, I think is very valuable and enhances the level of understanding of the complexities with the industrial base. So at this point, let me share. And hopefully this goes as planned. And if I can get a thumbs up from folks. It's a pleasure to speak with you today. I'm Professor Bob Mortlock, and today I'll be discussing a defense industrial base analysis. This research is going to use a case-based approach, and we're using body armor case study to do this DEB, or defense industrial base analysis. Within the body armor, there are basically two types of body armor: hard body armor and soft body armor. We're going to focus today on what we call hard body armor. These are ballistic plates that we insert into the soft armor vest. And these ballistic plates protect the warfighters against high-powered ballistic threats like rifle threats. That's going to be the focus of this case study as an example of a defense industrial base analysis. What's the so what? Well, these pictures summarize the so what and why this is so relevant to our warfighters. In this case, these plates were shot in battle in either Iraq or Afghanistan. The plates were then studied and analyzed, and then after they were studied and analyzed, returned to the warfighters. And what better way to show our warfighter the capability that we provide them in battle than to return a plate that potentially saved their lives while they perform their vital security missions for the protection of our nation and the security of our nation. This is the so what. This is why we do defense acquisition, to support our warfighter. And these are great examples of the relevance that acquisition professionals play. In general, we're going to use this body armor program, hard armor body armor program, to enhance skills and document lessons learned. It's applicable to defense acquisition professionals. The overall objectives: the first is develop critical thinking skills. the ability to critically analyze a project. Identify stakeholder engagement skills. Identify and then engage with the stakeholders so that their perspectives are understood. The ability to develop and then compare alternatives and then develop decision criteria and make recommendations for senior leaders to make informed decisions. And then understanding and the second order considerations of those strategies in the area of strategic leadership. Now, we all know that the defense acquisition framework is complex, and this is the wall chart that describes big A acquisition, which is not very useful to do a case-based analysis approach. But we can simplify that chart. And this is a good simplification and a lens with which we recommend and we used to do our case-based research. The PM is balancing cost, schedule, and performance. The PM has a chain of command, obviously, through the executive branch, and they provide oversight from Congress. We don't do anything. We put everything on Congress, our contract with industry. So those are the major stakeholders that we have to balance. And then we have 3 decision support templates or systems that help balancing cost, schedule, and performance. The first is the requirements generation system. The second is the resource allocation system, PPBE. And then finally, the management system, the adaptive acquisition framework. These 3 decision support templates are fundamentally driven differently, which makes balancing cost, schedule, and performance both an art and a science. Resource allocation system is calendar driven. You get money every year through the Appropriations Act. The general requirements or needs or capabilities based driven, and then our adaptive acquisition framework is events driven, adhering to the fundamental principles of knowledge-based acquisition. This is the lens, this picture of acquisition commonly referred to as big A acquisition. This is the lens with which we recommend we analyze the case. In this situation, we're looking at a specific example of the defense industrial base, and that's for hard armor. Congress has repeatedly asked for insights into this part of the industrial base. In 13, 14, and 15 NDAAs, they've asked reports from the Department of Defense and the Department of the Army. The Army responded with an industrial base analysis, saying that there are no easy answers or options, that we have limited procurement and decreasing demand, and it'll be hard to maintain lots of competition. Overall, the short-term risk was judged as significant by the Army because of a considerable drop in demand. Long-term, the risk is significant with a low demand and a dependence on the Department of Defense, meaning the industry is not only critical, but also fragile. Once a capability decreases, it takes about 18 months to reconstitute that capability if that manufacturer went out of business. There were also other reports that supported the Department of Defense and the Army as they prepared their follow-on reports. This study was done for the Defense Logistics Agency by IDA. This study was done by RAND, and this was a fragility and criticality analysis as part of the sector by sector and tier by tier review by the manufacturing and industrial base policy folks. Also, RAND did an analysis of our personal protective equipment. All this led to a report by Congress on personal protection equipment and a technical study by the Army specifically on body armor plates in the February 15 timeframe. So what's the issue here? What sets up this interesting case? It's because the Department of Defense and the Army were putting in their FY16 presidential budget, and in that budget, industry was not happy with the planned buys of body armor. And so the case questions are, who are the stakeholders? What are the assessments of the hard armor industrial base? What did the Army do with previous money? And what should be done moving forward based on the inventory of plates currently? Should they buy new or older plates? Should you buy to the operational requirement or maintain the industrial base? What are the advantages and disadvantages of options, and what should you recommend to Congress? You use this lens, for example, cost, schedule, performance, and the 3 decision support templates with your background information and stakeholders, and you start to study the constraints and considerations within the case. Industry had a much different assessment of the industrial base than the Army. They were concerned with future buys, minimum sustaining rates, layoffs, loss of capability, and they wanted to make legacy plates. Army was concerned with the low demand, low competition, and they wanted next generation plates. The Army, with previous funding, put that money toward next generation plates. And how does the current inventory of plates project into the future? What are we replacing, for example? Another consideration is, do you buy to the operational requirement, the acquisition objective, or do you buy to maintain an industrial base? And you have to balance then the risk in order to maintain vendors and avoid maybe a reconstitution time period. Was preserving 1 or 2 vendors preferred? And what are the advantages and disadvantages? And how do you take into account that the vendors had different business models? One question and constraint and consideration is buying lighter new plates at a higher cost or buying heavier legacy plates at a lower cost. This balance between cost decrease and, weight decrease versus cost increase. For a 266 set plate buy of the acquisition objective, this is about $134 million decision for about a 3/4 pound weight reduction per plate on a warfighter. And the benefits of decreased weight are many, to include mobility, lower injuries, lower long-term health industry effects. The bottom line is pounds of weight decrease for a warfighter is significant, but how much does it cost? Moving forward, you can consider these pressures from the case analysis of cost, schedule, performance, and industrial-based pressures, and you can consider various options. For example, buying to the acquisition objective or buying to the minimum sustaining rate, buying either legacy plates or newer plates, considering industrial-based maintenance contracts or foreign military sales. One thing that's important to do is develop criteria, discriminating criteria. That means criteria that can distinguish between these options. In this case, you can consider cost or performance and industrial-based concerns like capability, capacity, diminishing manufacturing shortages or material shortages, or obsolescence issues. And then you can do a comparison. A simple comparison of the advantages and disadvantages of those criteria compared to those options. It's really hard to make a recommendation to senior leaders for an informed decision based on this simple comparison. And that's why you might have to consider a decision matrix or a cost effectiveness analysis. The lessons learned in this case are many. First of all, you had to understand the options. New plates versus old plates versus maintaining an industrial base versus buying to a requirement. You had to consider criteria for those options. All these enhance the critical thinking and decision-making skills. When you analyze those options using a cost effectiveness analysis or a decision matrix, you again enhance those critical thinking and decision-making skills. Finally, you engage some stakeholder and strategic leadership skills as you make recommendations to Congress or to senior leaderships about potential National Defense Authorization Act language or potential marks to the presidential budget in the appropriations bill. These recommendations should satisfy the Department of Defense, industry, and Congress. The recommendations might be general for example, if you wanted to maintain the flexibility of the Department of Defense, not tie the hands of Congress, and also show that body armor and investment in body armor is important for the Department of Defense and the industry together. As a bottom line, it's important to encourage the examination of all possible options, the investments in research and development and next generation plates, an investment toward maintaining minimum sustaining rates of our manufacturers, an investment in industrial base maintenance contracts, an investment in foreign military sales of legacy plates, which will help the defense industrial base, and maybe stockpiling certain levels of plates to help preserve the industrial base and also have a stockpile for potential conflicts. Again, this was an example of a defense industrial base analysis using a case study based approach. The particular program here used was a body armor program of hard armor plates specifically. And I thank you, and I look forward to your questions. Larry, back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Bob. That was super. And so next up, Amanda, if you are ready to go and can grace us all with your presence, we'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay, well, good afternoon or good morning for those of you on the West Coast. As mentioned, my name is Amanda Bressler, and I am the Chief Strategy Officer for PW Communications, and our research focused on analyzing the composition of the small business defense industrial base. Now, so the crux of our research, for decades, the government has afforded small and disadvantaged businesses preferential treatment in the federal procurement process. Congress has a laundry list of justifications for the small business set-aside program, that it expands the federal supplier base, preserves and promotes free enterprise, increases competition, levels the playing field for small businesses in the government market, and more. Yet the success of the program has almost exclusively been measured by a single metric: whether the government awards 23% of total contract dollars annually to businesses that qualify by their standards as small or disadvantaged. Our research aimed to provide a more comprehensive assessment of the DoD's small business program vis-a-vis its stated objectives, and specifically to do so by leveraging large-scale publicly available data. For instance, considering that one objective of the set-aside program is to expand and diversify the industrial base, the number of small business contractors supporting DoD should increase over time. We sought to evaluate this metric, and specifically, that meant calculating the total number of small business contractors in the defense market in every year from fiscal year 2015 through fiscal year 2021. To do so, we leveraged data from FPDS and SAM to calculate the total number of unique vendors to DoD in each year and categorized each as either small or large. We found that the number of small businesses working with DoD declined almost 23% from 2015 to 2021. Yet over that same time, DoD small business spending increased an astonishing 68%. In other words, as small business spending went up, fewer and fewer small businesses benefited. How so? Well, it was at this point in our research that we realized that businesses with hundreds of millions and in some cases billions of dollars in DoD contracts annually can qualify as small by government standards. In fact, the number of small businesses doing $100 million or more in DoD contracts annually grew over 300% from 2015 to 2021. And meanwhile, the number of small businesses doing $1 million or less in DoD contracts annually shrank by 32%. Enabling certain types of companies to compete as small businesses, regardless of their revenue, incentivizes the DoD to work with and award large contracts to these larger small businesses. Since the DoD is not incentivized to exceed the 23% set-aside goal, smaller small businesses are in turn crowded out of the defense market. So rather than creating opportunities or leveling the playing field for small businesses, the set-aside program has in fact disproportionately benefited the largest small businesses, enabling them to expand their market share at the expense of opportunities for the truly small companies. Now, shifting gears, because small businesses, like large businesses, can win a contract as the prime and allocate work to teaming partners or subcontractors, we next sought to evaluate the effects of subcontracting practices on the DoD's small business industrial base. To do so, we leveraged subcontract award data from USA Spending. At first glance, we recognized many of the world's largest government contractors among the names of subcontractors to DoD small businesses. As you can see here, companies like Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon are subbing to small businesses, ultimately receiving hundreds of millions of dollars earmarked for small businesses. In fact, at least 16% of all subcontracting dollars associated with a small business prime went to large businesses. This is important to note because while there are merits to allowing large businesses to subcontract to small businesses, the policy has resulted, again, in large businesses receiving a substantial amount of money earmarked for small businesses. Furthermore, there is no evidence to suggest that current subcontracting policies enable more small businesses to participate in the defense market. On the contrary, as we're showing you here in this data, the industrial base continues to contract in spite of these allowances. Liberal teaming and subcontracting policies also create opportunities for the largest small businesses to partner together as similarly situated contractors and make the defense market even harder for small businesses to penetrate. Ultimately, in assessing the data, it became abundantly clear to us that limiting competition for certain contracts to quote unquote small businesses has done little to address the real underlying issues that keep small, non-traditional companies from succeeding in the defense market. In fact, the small business set-aside program actually creates a facade or a distraction. It gives the impression that the government is doing a good job of working with small businesses, while the reality on the ground for real small businesses gets worse. These underlying issues are many and varied, and they offer some explanation as to why we saw nearly a quarter of the small business defense industrial base disappear over the last 6 years. We've lent a good bit of attention to these issues in earlier research, including research we published here at NPS. And at the risk of going off on what could be like a 3-hour tangent here, right now I'll instead just highlight a few of these top line issues for you. So one, you've got the rising costs of doing business with the Defense Department. For instance, new cybersecurity compliance requirements like CMMC and various new insurance requirements. These cost companies tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. Larger small businesses have the ability to absorb these costs, while they end up making it impossible for the smallest small businesses to continue operating in the defense market, or worse, putting them out of business entirely. Shifts in DoD procurement strategies have also severely impacted the ability for small businesses to support DoD customers. For instance, DLA's recent contract bundling practice called Captains of Industry, which involves awarding multi-year, multi-billion-dollar sole source contracts to large OEMs, have resulted in dozens, if not hundreds, of small businesses losing their core customers overnight. Many of these companies have literally gone bankrupt, while others are on life support. Small businesses also struggle to navigate the complex anti-competitive solicitation processes. We wrote about this last year, but as a refresher, 70% of all DoD solicitations over the last 18 years required responses within 21 days of when they were posted. And fewer than 4% of DoD solicitation descriptions were written in plain English. Requirements aren't coordinated across government entities, meaning there are hundreds of open requirements for the very same product or service, and it's impossible for small businesses to determine which customers to support. Generally speaking, government stakeholders also have no idea what small businesses are being funded and fielded force-wide, Simply put, the Army has no idea what small business vendors the Air Force relies on, and vice versa, in spite of the fact that they all need many of the same things. As a result, government customers rely on the small universe of companies that they are familiar with, which makes it near impossible for small businesses to grow and scale inside this market. Again, these are just a few of the many obstacles facing companies that are anything but entrenched legacy contractors, be those entrenched contractors small or large. So to reiterate our major conclusions, ultimately, the small business set-aside program in its current form fails to meet its stated objectives. The DoD awards contracts to quote unquote small businesses that understand the system rather than companies with the best or most competitive offering. This not only reduces the availability of products and services in the government, but props up companies that should go out of business, but understand how to game the system and therefore continue to win contracts. So what now? Well, we have several recommendations for reforming how the small business program is both structured and measured to better align it with its objectives. Most importantly, the underlying issues I just discussed must be addressed. That really comes down to government being committed to creating a system that enables companies to succeed based on their merits, things like the innovativeness of their products and services, competitive pricing, ability to deliver on time. A company's merit must count for more than its ability to navigate an anti-competitive, bureaucratic, closed system. Now, in practical terms, we also have a series of more specific recommendations. First, it is imperative that the Small Business Administration overhaul its size standards. To the extent the government is going to afford preferential treatment in government contracting to small businesses, those businesses should at the very least be small. Consistency in size standards in general is also important. Right now, the criteria are very arbitrary. There was a chart in an earlier slide that showed arbitrary differences in what qualifies as small if you're a men's clothing store versus a women's clothing store versus a children's clothing store. These things must be streamlined in a logical and transparent way. We also suggest that the measure of success no longer be whether or not 23% of contract dollars are awarded to small businesses. Government stakeholders should be measured on specific metrics related to their portfolio of suppliers, including things like the number of new vendors that received contracts in a given year. As mentioned previously, right now, dollars flowing to large businesses also count towards small business goaling, and that needs to stop. So these are what I call common sense reforms that hopefully will gain momentum in the coming weeks and months, starting with this conversation here today. And to that end, my team and I, we are very eager to connect with others in this community and talk further about these issues and ideas. So I look forward to your questions. And with that, I will turn it back over to my co-panelists. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Amanda. That was fascinating, and I can say, having worked for a former small business that was desperately trying to get new work with the Department of Defense, it's really hard to figure out. And increasingly, we are in a world where those small businesses have services and products to offer to us that are way innovative and at much, produced at much lower overhead than we might be able to get out of a large business. So what you talk about here is critical. And I think it blends very nicely with our next panelist, Moshe Schwartz's presentation. And so with that, Moshe, I'll let you energize yourself and your camera, and we will look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just a thumbs up if you can all hear me, please.
Loud and clear.
Excellent. Thank you. So my name is Moshe Schwartz. I'm now president of Etherton Associates. I was the executive director of the 809 panel on acquisition reform, and I wrote a paper with Michelle Johnson from the Naval Postgraduate School, but I'm the one that's going to be presenting. But before I present, let me just say, it is not my favorite thing to go after Amanda whenever she presents. Her passion and her grasp of data is so excellent that I usually prefer to go before her because she's a hard act to follow. But I will do my best, and I will try to build on some of the things she said, because in a lot of ways there's a lot of data and a lot of information that we both found independently that we share. So we're going to talk about the defense industrial base. And actually, I prefer to use the term, just to start, the national security innovation and industrial base, if I can for a second, because it's not just about defense. This is about national security. It's not just the defense budget. It's like the national security budget. And it's not just industrial anymore. And it's also not just innovation, as some people talk about it. It really is the merging of the both. But that is a digression. But to start, some of the data that Amanda talked about, GAO has talked about and DoD has talked about, if you see on the left slide of this panel, the number of small businesses in DoD has decreased as spending has gone up. But it is not just small businesses. This is a problem writ large. In fact, as GAO pointed out, the number of large businesses from 2011 until 2020 that are receiving contract awards fell by 7.3% per year, right? And that is dramatic. Now, one could say, well, maybe the whole economy was shrinking. That is simply not the case. At the same time that there was tremendous decrease in the defense industrial base, be it small business, mid-tier business, or a large business, you saw the US economy doing pretty well. In fact, GDP grew by 34% from 2000. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Your slides are really small. We can't see them. Can you make them full screen, please?
Let me try to fix that. Hold on. I apologize. Let me try to fix this. You share.
Moshe, if you go into presentation mode, that would fix it.
Yeah, I thought it was. It's just sharing the wrong screen. Here, let me do this. Okay, is that better? No, that's still not it. Let me go to presentation mode. Apologize.
Down there on the bottom, that little screen. Keep going down the bottom to the
Let's
right.
do that. Can you see that better?
Yeah, if you click on that little screen click on the bottom. There you go.
There you go. Excellent. So you see the full screen? Excellent. Sorry. So as you see on the right side, GDP grew by 34% and the total number of businesses in the US increased by 7%, right? So what we see is there's an even increased defense and government spending is simply not sufficient to persuade companies to work with the Department of Defense. Now, many of you have probably seen DoD put out a report, State of Competition within the defense industrial base. And one of their findings was DoD needs to do more outreach to solve the problem of the shrinking defense industrial base. I have to say, and I'll try to say this politely, that seems to show a slight misunderstanding of how economics works, right? The job of businesses is to make money. If you are the single largest buyer of everything on the continent, industry knows you exist. It's not that you need to do more outreach. It's that they are choosing not to work with the Department of Defense. I think the question we have to ask is not how do we do more outreach, but how do we make the Department of Defense a customer that people in fact want to work with because it is a conscious decision not to work with the department. That is problem number one. But I think there is a second substantial problem. It's not just companies leaving the defense industrial base, it's that members who stay in the defense industrial base or the national security innovation and industrial base are being hamstrung by government policies to be truly innovative and adaptive. So there's this idea that we need more commercial technologies because they're more cutting edge, they're more advanced, they're faster. And there may be a lot of truth to that. But if you took those same commercial companies and brought them into the industrial base for the government, they would lose a lot of what made them nimble and what makes them innovative, right? To add to that, what we can do is create a scenario where the companies that are committed to the industrial base for the Defense Department and National Security have the ability to compete with private sector in all of those innovative and speed ways. And that is not the system that we have today, right? So some key findings here, what are companies interested in, right? Well, one of the things that drives companies away is intellectual property rights, right? Cash flow. These are the lifeblood or the crown jewels of industry. And to the extent that we are trying to get more IP without paying for it from the Department of Defense, or trying to be penny wise and pound foolish with cash flow, that is going to hurt and dissuade companies from wanting to work with the department. And the ones that do, it's going to hurt their ability to be innovative. The bureaucracy that slows acquisition timelines and the bureaucracy that slows transition to scaling up contracts. If you look at the crossing the valley of death, as it were, or successful OTA prototypes, and have few of them transition to follow-on production, as we know, companies aren't, by and large, their goal isn't to do the prototype, is to do that follow-on production. And if we can't get it there, we're losing a tremendous opportunity. And then all the policies that inhibit good business decision-making, we're going to get into that. So what are some of the recommendations? Obviously, cut bureaucracy and regulation, but we're going to get into that a little bit more in a moment. Operate with urgency, right? Timelines are a problem in the Department of Defense. The acquisition workforce, sometimes for reasons that aren't necessarily their fault, but because of bureaucracy that set up or regulations, aren't performing with a sense of urgency, or the system doesn't allow that sense of urgency and speed that you do see in the private sector, right? Protect intellectual property rights, and let's support the national security industrial base. And I want to take a moment on this. DoD spends a lot of time focusing on their workforce, and that is a great thing. But we also need to focus on the workforce for the national security industrial base, because people are not simply interchangeable. And if we cap salaries because of cash contracts for STEM and engineers, you're going to get what you pay for, right? And we're going to hurt the ability of these companies to be innovative. So we really need to think about, what are we doing for the national security industrial base workforce, particularly at a time where the economy is hot and there's low unemployment and people have options. We want to keep them, but in fact, a lot of these companies are losing top talent to the Googles and the Intels of the world. And I don't mean the IC, I mean Intel, the company. And then we put on these regulations like vaccines, whether it's a good policy or bad policy, that is driving people out of the workforce, where thousands of people were very clearly sooner willing to quit than work for these companies because the government was imposing a federal policy on the defense contractors. And then last is, let the NSIB companies act like commercial companies and innovate and do those things that businesses do. But I do want to talk very briefly about evaluating the regulatory environment, right? If you want to work for DoD and you haven't, you need to be CMMC compliant, or soon be. You have to abide by Section 889, that's the Chinese telecommunications prohibition. You have the Buy American requirements that you may have to change things over and disrupt your supply chains or hurt your competitiveness in the commercial market, which is everywhere else where you make money. You may have to install cost accounting systems. You have to build compliance capabilities for government unique requirements or audits or congressional hearings. In other words, to get the business, you need to develop a core competency of compliance. And is that really the acquisition system incentives that we want to create? I will stop at that and turn it over, because I think it'll be much more interesting to have a conversation. And I also definitely want to hear what Emily has to say about the EOs. And maybe as a segue to that is, let me pose this last question. Does it make sense for us to use the acquisition system, particularly the defense acquisition system, to promote public policies? Because some of those promotions of public policies are undermining the ability to get the things that the department needs to maintain its technological advantage for potential future conflicts. Thank you.
Moshe, what a fantastic question to conclude with. And as we get ready to turn it over to Emily, I just want to say, encourage everyone in the audience to type some questions into the Q&A button that you see down at the bottom of your screen. I personally can think of a lot of questions that Moshe just brought to my mind, and I'm sure that Emily will as well. So Emily, with no further ado, I'll turn it over to you, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Emily, you're mute.
Sorry about that. I was saying that thank you, Larry. And I think that Moshe's questions about how policies may be hamstringing the industrial base really feeds nicely into my topic of research, which was looking at how executive orders, specifically those that derive from the Federal Property and Administrative Services Act, are imposing additional requirements on government contractors and on the acquisition workforce. So while most people aren't familiar with FPASA, Federal Property Administrative Services Act, sometimes called the Property Act, it was passed in 1949, and it was, in 1949, as part of the government reorganization that came out of the Hoover Commission, with the effort of looking at how the government buys personal property and non-personal services, how it manages its property. And it gave the president really broad authority to prescribe policies and directives that they could use to effectuate the economy and efficiency in the federal acquisition arena, and deliver an economical and efficient system. For quite a while, it was used primarily to pass civil rights policies onto federal contractors. However, if you look at the last 30 years, so if we go back and look at the Clinton administration through the Biden administration, we start to see a trend, which is an increase in the number of FPASA orders used by each president. Now, keeping in mind that at the time that I wrote this, President Biden had been in office for 14 months. But if you look at the Clinton and Bush administrations, you'll see 5, 6 contracts, 1 to 2% of the total orders that were passed. A very low rate of using this authority for executive orders. When we get into the Obama and Trump administrations, you see a sharp increase. So you see it doubling under President Obama, and then President Trump kept up more or less the same rate of orders. He increased the number of overall orders, if you look at just over 4 years versus over 8 years, and still had a very high rate compared to Clinton or Bush. And then if you look at President Biden so far, now it's not a fair comparison because as I said, it's only been 14 months, but you see that he's already issued 6 executive orders using the FPASA authority, which then raises the next question of what are we talking about with these orders? And if you look at the topics of the orders, as I said, historically, they were about civil rights. However, if you look back into the late 70s through the present, they've become increasingly more about labor unions, collective bargaining. And if you were to look at the late 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the Clinton administration, President George W. Bush's administration, you'd see that the vast majority of these fell into labor unions, collective bargaining, non-displacement of incumbent workforce, and contractor compensation. Each president, has 1 or 2 issues they were going after that outside of those spaces, but there was a really strong concentration in the last 30 years on labor unions and incumbent workforce issues. However, what we started to see with the Obama administration, and that carried over to the Trump administration and has carried over into the Biden administration, is an incredible breadth of topics being added in. Everything from the incredibly non-controversial executive order saying that contractors may not text message while driving, to the vaccine mandate, to work with offshoring, contractor responsibility. And then the question becomes, well, what did these executive orders end up meaning? And in many cases, what we find is that the executive orders themselves become, instead of a source of economy and efficiency, they became a source of change and of churn. So if we were to look at the labor union collective bargaining executive orders, there have been 10 total issued. Of those, 40% of those are still in effect. But if we take out into account that those, or if we remove from that those that were signed by President Biden, which haven't had a chance to be addressed by a future president, you'll find that only 30% of them are in effect. That 40% of them end up being revoked by executive order, and that the courts have revoked 10% of those. Similarly, we'll find that there are other document areas where non-displacement of incumbent contractor workforce. It is almost guaranteed that every time the resident of the White House changes, that executive order is revoked and in a subsequent one issued. So we reverse the policy. As we start to look through though, we'll see that there are some additional trends in there. So we're starting to see courts become more and more active in these, and they tend to be more active in areas that aren't the traditional space for presidents to be using the FPASA authority. So for example, the vaccine mandate, there were 5 district courts, all of them agreed to withdraw to block implementation of the vaccine mandate for contractors. The civil rights area and topic that I mentioned earlier is one that traditionally had presidential use of FPASA. The one that was revoked was President Trump's order, and that was revoked by a court because they found that it was too vague to be understood what was actually being proposed or banned in it. So it's sort of an outlier. But contractor responsibility, which is an area you would think would normally fall within that promoting economy and efficiency, the courts have revoked 67% of those orders, and the Congressional Review Act actually revoked the 2 orders, and that was the Fair Pay and Safe Workplaces order. What we're not seeing here is also that there was one additional order that became public, and it was on elections and campaign contributions by contractors, and it was proposed by President Obama. It was leaked. Congress got a hold of it, held hearings, and ended up banning it actually as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. However, the FEC came back in and implemented a similar provision, but it was interesting to see that Congress did not feel that that was part of FPASA's authority. They instead believed that it was something, but it was an appropriate area or topic for the FEC to be looking at. The next question then becomes, well, when the courts are coming in and looking at these, and what is their standard? And there are 3 main cases that that I was looking at. The first one is AFL-CIO v. Khan, and that one gave us the idea that as we were looking at the economy and efficiency, it said that those are not to be narrowly construed. It's that instead that this was an executive order where President Carter had said that we weren't going to contract with companies that were not adopting the voluntary controls on wages and prices during the inflation of the late 70s. The court upheld that, saying that that not complying with that voluntary wage could indeed lead to a direct and immediate effect regarding holding down prices. So they found that there was a really strong nexus between what the president was doing and the executive order, but they said it doesn't have to be a very strong nexus. It has to be one that is a colorable argument. And so we saw the next series of cases going through and giving a lot of deference to the president when he was using his FPASA authority. Then the Reich case came in, the Chamber of Commerce versus Reich. And in that case, the president had sought to ban companies, contracts with companies that permanently replace striking workers. The court came in and said that this was a hard one for them to answer, and that actually in a previous case suggested that would be something they would allow. But they came in and they said that no, this actually preempted and usurped the authority under the National Labor Relations Act, and that FPASA couldn't be so broad as to do that. It had to be more narrowly tailored. And their famous quote was, "It's not a blank check." From that point forward, we saw FPASA that FPASA was used for things like the Fair Pay and Safe Workplaces Act, and the courts did put a injunction on that. However, it was withdrawn by the Congressional Review Act before anyone could decide on it. And so the most recent case is the contractor mandates cases. And those contractor mandate cases were fascinating because we have 5 different district courts looking at FPASA and whether or not the authority was there. And they all unanimously agree that this could not be implemented, but they had very different reasons for doing so. They almost all thought it was too broad of a use of FPASA. They said that this was not within the scope that was foreseen. Some argued that it was preempting the state's power for police or health. Others came in and said no, that it violated the non-delegation authorities, that Congress can't delegate its legislative authority to the executive branch. And so this was so broad that if we read it to actually be within the scope of FPASA, it would actually mean that FPASA itself was unconstitutional. The others said that should have been more in line with OSHA's authority. And then they pointed and said that even the Fifth Circuit had denied that OSHA had the authority to do this. So if OSHA didn't have the authority to put in place a vaccine mandate, surely FPASA didn't. It also led to some wonderful language where the courts tried to outdo themselves in coming up with the most ridiculous health-related argument one could make to use FPASA. They suggested it could be used to ban obese workers from working. They suggested it could be used to ban contractors from drinking sugary sodas. They came up with every use they could come up with and unanimously rejecting this case. But it ultimately leaves us with a situation where when we look at the trends, we're seeing an increased use of FPASA. We're using it to address policy issues where Congress itself cannot come to an agreement, so that there is not an agreement as to how we should be proceeding. So the executive branch then moves on its own. However, the economy and efficiency have become very nebulous concepts because we have the same legislation being used as the authority for an executive order that says you shall not replace the incumbent workforce. You must first make an offer to the incumbent workforce, and others that say, no, that's not required at all. You've got some that say you must provide information on the unionization rights. Others say, no, you must provide instead information that says you don't have to unionize. So we've got 180s that are going back and forth with many of these executive orders. Ultimately, that means that contracting officers, well, first the FAR Council gets these executive orders. They then spend ideally 40 weeks, usually more than that. I think D-League always said we could do it in 40 weeks. I never thought we actually got an executive or a regulation done in 40 weeks. But we would have an executive order come in. We would spend a year putting in place a new regulation. We would train the contracting workforce on that. We would then have to, in many cases, modify the contracts that we had, only to 3 to 7 years later, do the exact same thing all over again. Same thing with the issues such as the vaccine mandate, text messaging, this broad, expansive issues that keep being added to the scope of FPASA orders. So my two recommendations were that Congress needs to look at executive orders relying on FPASA. And the first thing that I suggested they do is explicitly state that they are relying on that FPASA authority. Presidents have, in the last several years, become more and more likely to instead say that an executive order is instead based on their authority is under the Constitution, the laws of the United States. And it's only when it gets to court we realize that it's FPASA that they're using. So explicitly stating FPASA and the link to FPASA. But further than that, when FPASA orders are being issued, Congress should then require that there be explicit and measurable goals as to how it's going to increase economy efficiency, and require that someone, perhaps the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, be tasked with actually tracking the results and publicly reporting, so that FPASA doesn't become a pretext for other social issues. It instead really goes back to its roots to ensure the effective, efficient administration of the federal government. And with that, I will turn it back over to Larry. Thank you.
Okay, Emily, thank you for that excellent presentation, and definitely more for all of us to think about. We've received several questions in the Q&A, and I would ask the panelists to take a look at those. A couple have, I think Amanda took a stab at answering a couple of them, but we might have time to readdress those depending on how we go here. I did want to ask, I just wanted to start off by broadly asking each of you. You've given a lot for, you've given us a lot to think about in terms of how to improve the national security industrial base. And I wonder whether you might offer for those hardworking government officials or industry folks who are out in the office or out in the audience, potentially even future government policymakers who might be at school at the Naval Postgraduate School right now. I wonder if you might just give them sort of your priority or on what might be of the topics you addressed, the single most important topic that would return the greatest return on investment for their time, should they decide to tackle it. So we're not necessarily talking about the lowest hanging fruit, but some combination of lower hanging fruit, but significant impact. I'll leave it to each of you I suppose I probably need to call on someone first. Moshe, I see you're up, so I'm gonna go ahead and call on you first.
Sure, I guess that's a lesson that I should be the last one to turn on my video. So lesson learned here. I guess the one thing I would say, and I've spent more than 15 years in various government positions, I would say the one thing is try to change the bloody culture, right? I remember speaking to somebody who was a reviewer in one place I worked, and they said, you can do that, but if you do that, we do not have your back, right? But it was the right thing to do. And I did it anyhow, but I can tell you 90% of my colleagues wouldn't have done it. And I'm not sure if that makes me an idiot. And that's probably the answer, right? Or not. But there's this culture that is so risk averse. And I'll just give one example for contracting: bid protests. Bid protests should not be something you should be afraid of. They are something that you should embrace, right? For a couple of reasons. One is, if you get a bid protest, at least you're thinking a little bit differently. But more importantly than that, the only way to find out if you can do something is to trigger that bid protest and get them to issue an opinion and find out, well, can I do it or can't I do it? So those should not be a negative, those should be a positive. And that's just one example of if we can change the culture of how things are done, of risk aversion and lack of urgency, which I know is baked into the system. It's not based on the individuals. I think that would have the most bang for the buck, just because if you watch MASH, you look at a guy like Radar O'Reilly, right? That was a culture, just get it done, right? I'll stop there, over.
So what I find interesting about it is that essentially, I think you can dispute whether I have summarized this accurately or not, but I think what you're saying is to take a look at the incentives of the people who are the employees who are actually trying to execute these policies and these actions, these procurement actions on behalf of the government, and figure out how to incentivize them to taking more risk or accepting smart risk.
Yeah, so 100%, and I had to cut through the bureaucracy. If you look at some of the people in the last 3 months who have resigned from DOD pretty noisily, frankly, you have Brown, who just left DIU, you have Jelaine, who was software at the Air Force, you had a couple of other people who have been in the media. They've all said the same thing. There's no urgency, there's too much bureaucracy, things aren't getting done. So I agree with you 100%. And I would also add not only the incentives of the workforce, but also look at the leadership. Is the leadership doing what they need to do?
Yes, absolutely. I could go on and rail against myself, as a matter of fact. But yes. So Amanda, it looks like you're ready to go. So over to you.
Yeah, Moshe, I could not agree more with everything you just said, and also with the point you made at the end of your presentation. What is the purpose of government contracting? It's so the government can buy things that it needs. And we as a country, leadership inside of the government, there needs to be a serious conversation about whether or not you should use government contracting to promote certain social agendas. What concerns me, and this is a bit of a digression to your specific question, Larry, but I think it's an important point. What concerns me is that we identify that these set-aside programs, they fail to benefit the communities that they are quote unquote designed to serve. And there seems to be momentum right now inside of the government to codify even more special groups. Now there's talk of this, they have yet to be codified, but these other kinds of businesses they're very nebulous that are coming out of the White House. Like, it's very difficult to prove the, sexual orientation of the CEO of a company. And to the extent that you codify rules that allow certain kinds of businesses that are run by women or whatever it may be to win contracts just because of that, you will suffer at the hands of the merit and the innovativeness of the solutions that you have access to, because the underlying issues aren't addressed. So I think, to segue into a more specific answer to your question, what should folks inside of the system do? Well, those of them that have influence should push for the kinds of changes I note, like small businesses you shouldn't qualify as small if you have a $3.5 billion market cap as a public company. That doesn't make any sense. But in the near term, individual contracting officers can govern their own decisions using common sense. They can apply percentage requirements to their portfolio. Like, okay, if we actually want to do a good job of attracting innovation, maybe we should set goals for ourselves before they are required of us, that we should have some percentage of companies that we've never worked with before come into the system. That's at least one way of kind of proxying new and innovative. It's not a perfect proxy, but at least beginning to measure these things and hold yourself accountable would start to move the needle. Ultimately, they need to be codified, but individual contracting officers have the ability to ask for data around who's in their supplier base, and does that supplier base reflect the objectives that we've articulated in our policies and plans.
That's a great answer, and both the specific and the your initial response. And so with that, Dr. Mortlock, I'll pass it over to you and see if you have any thoughts. Over.
Yes, thanks, Larry, and thanks. I do agree generally with what the panelists are saying. I think I probably have a different perspective on, you asked for what is the biggest bang or return on investment. And I guess after 20 years of being a program manager within this system, I truly believe that the system is not the problem and the policies are not the problem. The biggest bang on return on investment is the education of the entire acquisition workforce. I use education broadly. It involves training, it involves knowledge, it involves experience. But I truly felt empowered to make things happen. What the barriers that existed were that I didn't know the system well enough to get through it. And when I did know the system well enough to get through it, I manipulated it, I delivered at the speed of relevance. And that education also is for the industrial base side. And so encouraging those folks to get educated so that they can navigate the process as well. And I probably am on the other side of because defense acquisition, the federal acquisition regulations are policy, national security policy elements that have been put in place for specific reasons. Now we can debate on whether we've done it properly, but when I was a PM and I was setting aside making or delivering contracts to small disadvantaged businesses or National Institute of the Blind, those companies were delivering quality products, and that was what we wanted. And we were also supporting a national policy objective of supporting small disadvantaged businesses, and so I don't think it's either that or this. I think if we all get educated on the system, we can better navigate it, and that's where I would place the emphasis on return on investment.
Well, you'll certainly find me in support of more education. Of course, that presumes you can keep people in the contracting world long enough to be able to educate them on its myriad and Byzantine complexity. Which is something that I think, given one of the papers, is probably a bit of a question mark. Emily, just wanted to see if you had any. your research was targeted towards sort of a different level, but I wanted to see if you had anything you wanted to add to that. Over.
So what I'd add to it is that if I were making a recommendation, it would be twofold. And part of it comes from, I spent half my career working for Congress, half working for the executive branch. I do think Congress needs to take a hard look at FPASA and whether or not they intend that authority to be that broad. And if they wanted to narrow it down so that it is actually related to, truly tied to increasing economy or efficiency in procurement rather than trying to implement social policies. The other part of that, though, would be that for senior procurement executives and agency leaders to start asking questions when those executive orders come out, asking for documentation as to how those do tie into supporting FPASA's objectives. Those memos, those really are helpful as Congress is doing its oversight, but also as the courts are looking at and assessing those, and they help direct the energy and make sure that we're focused on really on the procurement system rather than on the myriad of social goods we can do using procurement.
So as we know, it's difficult for folks in the executive branch you certainly can't lobby Congress. And we would never think of doing that. But if we do want Congress to pay attention to something, it probably requires someone to call it to their attention. And would that someone be the affected industries, in your opinion? Over.
The affected industries would be very good. If you remember during the Obama administration, there was a letter signed by, I want to say, over a dozen contracting groups that went to Congress and to the White House explaining what this was doing to the industrial base, what these executive orders, the effect of it. And it was really helpful for Congress in doing their oversight. Someone needs to be continuing to bring that to Congress's attention, that there is a tension between doing good through contracting and contracting.
Excellent. So with that, and thank you all for playing along with me on that. I want to go to the questions, the unanswered questions we have in the chat here, and the first one is from Matt McGregor, who asks, to the point that profit is what motivates companies to invest, how would you recommend weighted guideline, or how would recommend weighted guidelines be modified to permit higher profit for higher risk projects, or should weighted guidelines be abandoned altogether? I think I'm gonna open that up, but I'm thinking that it's probably Moshe or Amanda answer that one. Over.
So I took the last one first. Does that allow me to kick it to Amanda?
Amanda, you want to give it a whirl?
Yeah, it's sort of like kind of a short answer and a bit of a non-answer. I think my feeling is that these issues are actually downstream of the real problems that keep kind of innovative companies from entering the system. They don't get this far oftentimes. It's not to say this is not a real problem, but like what I kind of mentioned in the presentation, if you haven't worked with the government before and you're, say, a drone company and there's 132 open requirements for drone stuff, and like you're basically confronted with the reality that this is a pay-to-play ecosystem, and you make a decision. You might even be well capitalized enough to pay to play, but that might insult your intelligence, and so you don't want to go down that path. Like, I think the problems are actually higher in the bottleneck, but what you bring up is certainly an issue in terms of retention of the supplier base. And I'm not, I don't know what the kind of trade-offs would be. Certainly in things that we like, the type of work we do, like data analytics, yeah, profit should be like, their rate schedule doesn't make sense based on the commercial market. If you want to pay a top tier data scientist $75 an hour or whatever the government kind of like labor category chart looks like, you're not going to have a good result. They should not care if those data scientists are $500 an hour, because if they are, they're probably going to need one instead of 22 of them. And I think that sort of relates to this profit question. Moshe, you probably have a more articulate answer that's grounded in like FAR and the real things here. So,
so I will definitely, I promise to quote the FAR in this answer, but I would agree. DoD frequently in their contracting has this concept of butts and seats, and that's just not what matters, right? So about a couple months ago, Apple decided, and this was in the media, to just out of the blue, give $200,000 bonuses to some of their top engineers to retain them. So let's put this into perspective. Apple is giving unrequired bonuses to engineers that are high enough to basically match or exceed what DoD is paying their engineers or what they will pay contractors, right? And how do you expect to get the innovation there? Or to give another example, so, the Armed Services had a couple of, it wasn't Armed Services, House Oversight had a couple of hearings on truth in negotiations and capping profits, right? So what you had is members of Congress sitting there asking questions about how dare this company charge more than 15% on a fixed price contract while drinking a Starbucks that charges a lot more than 15% of what the actual cost of a coffee is, right? And you wonder why the industrial base has shrunk by 45% among small businesses and similarly among all businesses. It makes no sense. So you could pursue the guidelines, and even if they're guidelines, they should be just guidelines, right? Or you can pursue that, or you could pursue value. What is the value that you are getting? Would you rather pay a smaller profit percentage and even a smaller total number for something, or would you rather pay more for more quality? And I'll just give one example. When I first have kids, and I have too many kids, I've got 4. When I first had kids and they were going to school, I thought, okay, this is a really good idea. I'm buying the $25 backpack for them. And what ended up happening is I was buying backpacks every year for these kids because they would beat them up and throw them on the floor. So we started saying, we're going to buy the $75 backpacks, and they're still using the same one 5 years later, right? That's a totally different construct. You're not looking at cost, you're looking at value. And I would suggest that kind of perspective could be useful. And I think I mentioned the FAR, Amanda. I think I did.
Excellent. So, so there was another question in the chat that had to do with IP being in tension with competition. And Moshe, you were going back with Gregory Sanders on that. We have only 2 minutes left. But I'm curious about this because this comes up so often. Essentially, he's saying 70% of dollars of traditional project lifecycle goes to sustainment. And if the government doesn't have key IP and data rights, they're highly reliant on the OEM for upgrades. So essentially, he's saying this modular open system approach attempts to use the IP and allow for lower barriers, but also a wide range of competitors. So just thoughts on that.
So I'll jump in, but others please do. And Greg, this is a conversation we should have, I would say, over coffee, but this definitely deserves beer more than coffee, perhaps even whiskey. But a couple of things on that. One is, so you can take the position, right, we need the IP, but if you're not willing to pay for it, you might not get it at all. So do you want to not buy the IP because you're not willing to pay for it and have lower O&S costs? That makes no sense to me, right? Because if we don't buy the IP, competitors sure as hell are going to buy that IP, right? And so I think that is a fundamental problem. So it's like buying an Apple phone. I'm kind of stuck on that O&S costs for the rest of my life, but I will take it for the product that I want. So that's number one. Number two is part of this is the DoD construct, right? How many companies are there that say we're going to get the contract and get whole on O&S and make the profit on O&S? If you want to change that IP construct with Moshe, then change the economic model and let companies make money on the platform. But if you want them not to make money on the platform and not to make money on the O&S, that's not the most compelling business case that I have heard to get people to work for you, right? So just a thought, and there's more to that to unpack. And I know some of this is a little bit tongue in cheek, and I get that, which is why I suggest a longer conversation. But that would be my 2 minutes. Oh.
That's great. Bob, did you have something you want to say? It looks like you might.
No, I think we don't have much time left, but yeah, I mean, it's all about, it depends. It depends on if it's a research and development effort. It depends on if it's a procurement effort. It depends on if it's cost plus contract or a fixed price type contract. And so unfortunately, that's my standard answer. When it's more complex and for IP, it's all about dual use technologies. And we definitely need to encourage the commercialization of those technologies and then the militarization of those technologies when we can. And that's really the challenge that we're seeing.
Well, excellent. With that and a little less than 1 minute to go, rather than cutting someone off looking like, you know, a fish on television, we'll just go ahead and stop what has been a fascinating discussion. I wish it could continue. I think it would be great to get together over Moshe's proposed whiskey, beer, or other beverage of your choice and have these discussions. And I look forward to actually spending some time with all of you in person here sooner rather than later. Take care, everyone. Be in good health. And thanks so much for attending today's panel.
Thank you very much.